Welcome to the IEA's podcast, Everything Energy. I'm Dan Hewitt. After decades of stagnation, is nuclear energy set to make a comeback? Electricity from nuclear power is due to reach record levels this year, and around the world, dozens of reactors are currently under construction. But what's changed? Is it the urgency of energy security? Do net zero goals now outweigh our fears about nuclear safety? And is nuclear energy ever going to reach its potential if we can't reduce delays and construction costs? I'm joined today by the IEA's Brent Warner, a lead author of several special reports on nuclear energy. Brent, thanks so much for joining us today. I want to start with just a one-word answer. Do you think nuclear energy is making a comeback?
I do think it is set for, yes is the answer. It is set for us to enter a new era and to make a comeback.
And I think to explain the journey of nuclear, let's start in the 1960s. Maybe you could give us a sense of the optimism surrounding this new technology, especially in places like America.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there was a sort of a golden era for nuclear energy in the development in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where there was such a huge expansion of nuclear energy construction. The United States, France, Japan, Russia was also building at the time. At that point, there were promises of the future of nuclear energy that it would be too cheap to meter, that we would power all of our needs from nuclear energy. But things have not turned out that way. At the time, it was very much about the new technologies coming and this sort of modern technology and bringing us into a modern era. What some stumbles along the way, and there were some setbacks on the technology side and on the cost side. So I think this is the challenges of actually building out huge infrastructure became a reality. We had some countries were able to build nuclear plants in series, like in France, where we had the same design many times over and driving down those costs. While in the United States, for example, almost every nuclear reactor is unique in some way. And so that actually kept the costs from coming down in many aspects. So those promises of very, very cheap electricity largely went undelivered. And then we also had some challenges in terms of accidents. So there were some large nuclear accidents over the years. The first was in 3 Mile Island in the US in 1979. Then we had also an event in Chernobyl in 1986. And these were big setbacks that forced the industry to have a close look at the designs, to increase safety features, and also caused public acceptance challenges of whether this was the right technology for every country and for meeting our overall energy needs. Now, we were seeing a recovery, and there was promises of a comeback and even a renaissance around 2000, the year 2000. But then, unfortunately, we had an accident at Fukushima Daiichi in 2011 in Japan that proved another setback for the industry. Again, looking at safety reviews and the technology. And we are now coming into an area where momentum is building again. And that's where we are today here in 2025.
Now, you mentioned some of those very publicized accidents that happened around the world. I've got some interesting stats on the number of new nuclear reactors that came online. In the 1970s, there were 161. In the 80s, 171. In the 90s, that fell just to 19. And from 2000 to 2010, it was just 6. So maybe you just tell us a bit more about how those accidents made it more difficult to turn a profit, how there were more regulations, how it became more complicated for companies to actually want to invest in nuclear energy.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge for the nuclear industry was then with these accidents, it forced much higher safety regulations, much more review periods for the design themselves at the beginning, but then also during construction certification. So what we saw is that individual projects took longer to build. They took longer to be approved to be built even before that. And so these advanced designs, which are the fleet's new reactors that we are building now, have much enhanced safety features compared to those built decades ago. But that meant that they were higher cost to build, that they were more complicated to build. And these are very large, complicated investments that also require tens of billions of dollars for projects. And that became quite difficult for individual companies to take on that scale of investment and with the timeframes and timelines that were needed and are normal for a nuclear reactor.
And can you tell us a bit about how the energy mix has changed? Because there was a point 30, 40 years ago when nuclear energy made up quite a large percentage of the energy mix, but it's further below that today. So it's taken us a long time to recover.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so advanced economies moved and were developing nuclear power earlier. And so we saw a peak in the late 1990s for advanced economies where nuclear power was providing more than a third of electricity in the European Union. It was close to that level, almost over 30% in Japan and around 20% in the United States. Now, if we fast forward to today, that number has fallen quite sharply in the European Union. We're down under 25%. Japan, following the accident at Fukushima Daiichi, dropped to zero and is now recovering is close to 10% today. Now, the US has been fairly stable, around 20%, but it tells you the role of nuclear energy went from one where it was expanding, providing about a third and growing, to one where recovering, and today in total, globally, we're only providing 10% of electricity from nuclear power.
Now, it feels like the IEA has put out a lot of reports on nuclear energy. Does that in part reflect how rapidly the picture is changing?
Yeah, so we've had a series of reports going back. We had to 2014, 2019, 2022, and now early in 2025. And we marked these reports in particular to mark changes in the momentum, changes in what's going on, and the discussions in the energy world. So in 2019, for example, there was a few signs of new momentum for nuclear energy, but there were a lot of questions. And in particular, we saw that the existing fleet of nuclear reactors was aging, and there was a risk that they would be shut down possibly before where they could be extended. So one of the key issues then was highlighting that there was a big opportunity that was maybe going to expire if they weren't renewed, if they weren't extended. In 2022, we focused more on the role of nuclear energy in energy transitions and fulfilling country plans to reach net zero emissions, which was a growing trend at that point. And now in 2025, we see that on the technology side and the industry that there's growing momentum. There's more countries pursuing nuclear energy than ever before. And so we're marking these as kind of changes in the direction of travel along the way.
Now, it feels like one of the shifts has been to do with geopolitics, and it's to do with countries' desire for greater energy security. And there's been big triggers for that. For example, the natural gas spike we saw around the war between Russia and Ukraine. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how countries have actually reversed or changed their policies towards nuclear energy over the last few years.
Yeah, so I think certainly with some of the market volatility we've seen for other fuels and just a general focus on energy security, which of course has been a part of the energy landscape for many years, for decades, is part of the founding of the International Energy Agency, is around energy security risks. But those risks are evolving and change. And so this is part of the reason nuclear has been a part of the energy system and continues to be, because it is quite a reliable, round-the-clock source of electricity. And so as countries look to reinforce their electricity security, there has been a growing interest in nuclear energy to complement other sources like wind and solar, but also fossil fuels, and to reduce some of those risks related to prices around fossil fuels, which of course we've seen some of that volatility in recent years. So a few countries where we've seen changes in policy recently, Korea has had policies that supported nuclear, then briefly stepped away from nuclear, and now supporting again. We have seen discussions here in France, actually, where there's been now a debate, long-term debate about the role of nuclear energy in the long term. We are now back in a period where there's acceptance of needing to build new nuclear reactors in order to continue to be the primary source of electricity in France. I think in the United States as well, which has the largest fleet of nuclear reactors in the world, there has been some ongoing debate of its role. But we do see support for new technologies, new innovation in nuclear, and it's a bipartisan support in the United States for nuclear energy in general. But it's a question of these technologies being commercially ready and also the workforce and supply chains being there to actually build out those new reactors.
And I'm going to ask you about net zero goals as well, because at the moment it feels like the key drivers of clean energy are wind and solar. So how do you think net zero goals have changed the debate about people's willingness to accept nuclear energy?
Yeah, I think the key thing there is that it's looking at the package of technologies that can help you deliver the net zero goals. Wind and solar are certainly at the forefront here, are now the cheapest sources of electricity in most markets around the world. And most countries are pursuing these. We see widespread policy support for solar and wind. Nuclear is now supported in over 40 countries. So it is a complementary role to wind and solar in most markets. But again, it can be dispatched. It's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It has a good track record of being online. We see many reactors that operate more than 90% of the time during the year. And so it helps provide stability to the electricity grid. And that security is very valuable and as a low emissions source of electricity. So alongside wind and solar, alongside hydropower, nuclear power can play a significant role. And we see it as part of the cost-effective package of technologies that can help deliver net zero goals.
I want to ask you about price points. So where is the price for nuclear energy right now, and where does it need to get to make it more competitive?
So you have to think in terms of countries here, because the cost of individual projects ranges quite a lot. But some of the recent projects we've seen in the United States and Europe, on average, have been 2.5 times the original cost estimates, and that's put them somewhere between $150 and $200 per megawatt hour. Now, that is well above the average costs of generation. That's well above some of the competitive or other sources. So we would need to see costs below $100 a megawatt hour to be part of an overall cost-effective mix. If those projects could be delivered on time and on budget, they should be in the range of $60 to $80 a megawatt hour, and that would put them comfortably in the cost-competitive mix. Now, at the same time, in China, new projects are being delivered for around the $60 per megawatt hour price point. That has also been delivered for new projects in other emerging markets, including in the United Arab Emirates. So it is these are projects that have been completed, and so we see those projects can be built for those price points. It's just that we need to avoid these delays and cost overruns for the new large projects.
Now, if the world wants to change its course on nuclear energy, it's going to need to confront the issue of cost and delay. Now, can you give us a sense of how long it should take to build a nuclear reactor, and then what the reality of that is, and how often we see delays in the construction process?
So nuclear reactors are generally scheduled to take about 5 to 8 years to construct. Some countries are aiming at shorter periods, but that's the general range on the original plans, including in the United States and in Europe. Unfortunately, what we've seen recently, projects in the US and Europe have taken an average of 8 years longer than that kind of range. So they've taken more than a decade to build, and often 15 years or even longer. And that is partly, these are in some way explained that they're one-off projects. Many of these were first-of-a-kind projects, new technologies. Several of them had significant redesigns after they started construction. So after following the accident of Fukushima Daiichi in 2011, there were additional safety reviews and redesigns. So there's a reason to believe that these delays are not going to be repeated for the next wave of reactors. But those delays have also meant that the costs were on average more than about 2.5 times what the original cost estimates were. And these are already projects that would cost close to $10 billion, but that meant those project costs were significantly increased. And that's really imperative that new nuclear projects are delivered on time and on budget. Now, not all countries have seen such long delays. So China, Russia, and Korea are 3 examples where they've been able to construct new reactors in significantly less than 10 years, so in the 6, 7, 8-year range, which is closer to the original design or the original plan. So it is possible, and there are examples. And I think it's really imperative that the nuclear industry can deliver on those timelines.
And why is it that there's longer delays in places like Europe and America? Because the technology, as we've discussed, has been around since the 60s. Is it an issue that people have fallen out of practice? Do you see some of those delays reducing? What do you think some of the reasons are?
Yeah, so I mentioned one is that certainly these redesigns for some of these first of a kind projects. So while nuclear itself in broad terms is a well-established technology, these new designs, when they're first of a kind, they always will take longer to build, or they always will be a bit more difficult. Now, as you said, you rightly pointed that but the experience has significantly gone down. We quote those numbers of how many reactors had been built. When you're building 170 reactors in a decade, there's a lot of experience, there's a lot of technical experience from engineers to welders, very specialized talents. But when we moved away and slowed down the pace of construction, reestablishing those supply chains and reestablishing those skills is difficult and takes time. And we've seen that be a cause of delays as well.
Now, you mentioned a little earlier the issue of extending the lifespan of nuclear reactors, but what does that mean in practice? Does that mean the initial estimates are a bit conservative of 40 to 50 years, and the thing people are automatically going to think of is it safe?
So that's the safety point is really essential here, that any of these lifetime extensions, it's critical that they have independent safety reviews to make sure that all of the elements of the reactor are still in good working order. The original design lifetimes were 40 to 50 years. And these are lifetime extensions, which are most commonly 10-year extensions. So looking at once that safety review has been done, this is a very low-cost option, assuming that it can be operated. There aren't major revisions that are needed and that these safety reviews have been completed. So they're big opportunities because we have very large nuclear fleets in the United States, in France, in Japan, in other countries in Europe that are nearing these original design lifetimes of 40 to 50 years. Now, because of the engineering side, you might think these were set slightly conservatively, but we're also, this is such a long period of time that now with a 10-year extension or even 20 years sometimes in the US, it's really how have these weathered, how have these aged over the years, and looking at the equipment we have. We also now have more technologies also for the evaluation of how these reactors and the state of them. So I think the technologies external to nuclear itself have also advanced, which then can enable these longer lifetimes.
Now, tell me a bit about the global picture. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about what's going on in China and how close they are to, in fact, becoming global leaders of nuclear power.
China certainly has changed the landscape in the nuclear energy space. Their first reactors was completed around 1990, commercially generating electricity, which is much later than the wave that we mentioned earlier about in the 60s and 70s and 80s of construction. So China at that point, starting on the nuclear journey, let's say, has taken some time to establish itself. It was only generating 2% of its electricity from nuclear in 2010. That number is only 5 or 6% today. But it's because also the scale of China is so large. But now China is, the current pipeline of nuclear projects, China is actually constructing more than half of them. In the last 5 years, most new construction starts have been in China and of Chinese design, which is a major change that they're developing their own domestic designs. Currently, they're deploying those domestically, but they're also starting to look externally to export some of those technologies. So today, they are one of the larger fleets, but the US and Europe still have much larger nuclear fleets in operation. But we see with the current pace of construction and projects, by 2030, China is anticipated to have the largest operating nuclear fleet in the world. And that's a major change, as we said, from starting, let's say, 30 years behind many advanced economies getting on that journey on nuclear development.
So sticking again with geopolitics, I'm interested to know what impact supply chains could have on the expansion of the nuclear fleet. Because, for example, I think 40% of nuclear enrichment currently happens in Russia. So what impact could that have on Europe or America, who are still looking to expand their nuclear capacity?
Yeah, exactly. Like any technology, nuclear industry has to look at the supply chain, has to look at the overall picture for the technology. It's not just constructing the reactor, it's then how do you fuel it. Now, one thing to say that's a bit different than a coal or gas-fired power plant is that a nuclear reactor only requires to be refueled every 18 months. So the inherent risks or associated with fuel supply is a bit different because it's not a daily or weekly supply that needs to be provided. Now, having said that, Russia does produce 40% of enriched uranium in the world, and there are 4 leading companies that produce 99% of all enriched uranium, so it's quite a concentrated supply chain. But it's also recognized that this needs to be more diversified. So there are investments ongoing in the United States, in France, in China, and in Japan to expand enrichment facilities in order to broaden that and diversify the supply chain. So I think this is one point that is recognized and does require more attention from governments. And some of the new technologies that are coming are looking at using different types of nuclear fuels that will then require new supply chains being developed there, but can also help diversify the overall supply chain.
Now, a topic, if you've been following the nuclear debate, a lot of people have been hearing about small modular reactors. Now, for some people, this is a hypothetical idea. Some people, this is a sort of Hail Mary that may or may not work. So first of all, just tell us in basic terms what they are.
So small modular reactors itself is a slightly imprecise term, probably a place to start. But generally, we're talking about reactors that have a rated capacity of 300 megawatts or less, where an average large-scale reactor is 1,000 megawatts and often above that. So we're talking about significantly smaller in terms of output. And because of that, hold a promise to be significantly lower upfront cost. And because of the smaller size, actually, of a reactor, there are intentions for it to be something that can be produced much more in a factory setting. So I think one thing to understand about a large-scale reactor is that actually most of it is constructed on site. And for anyone who's ever been involved in a construction site, whether it's down to a household, they know that building anything outside on site is complicated. You're exposed to the weather, you're exposed to delays on things arriving on time. The promise for small modular reactors is that the vast majority and the most complicated elements, including the reactor, can be built in a factory setting and brought in one piece to the site. So I think that's a fundamental kind of point that could separate this technology from what we've known of large-scale reactors. There are a huge number of these reactor designs under development, so there's over 70 designs in the world. But we tracked also that there are 10 to 12 leading designs which are much closer to being ready in the market. So we would expect the first commercial SMRs to be built around 2030, and then to have a second wave in the 2030s of SMRs. Now, China is already building them, Russia is already building them, and the US is a leader here on the innovation side, but we'll also see them in Europe. So it's not just happening in one place. We're seeing quite a widespread interest in this, and also from the government level, but also from the private sector. So technology companies are very interested in funding and developing SMRs, also to meet new demands like data centers. And so there's multiple aspects that are all pointing at small modular reactors as something that could really change the nuclear industry.
If policymakers and governments decide they want to support these small modular reactors, what sort of things do they need to do? Are we talking purely about finance? What would we like to see?
So given where small modular reactors are now, they're very much at the design stage. And in fact, we have, in advanced economies, only one design that's been fully approved. So there's a very important step now on the regulatory side to approve new designs. And there are many of these reactors that are currently in this process, but having this performed in a streamlined and efficient way is really important. That's a very important first step. As these reactors then become more available for commercial orders to be deployed, this is where governments have a role to help de-risk some of this investment. So there are elements in the development process for a nuclear reactor during the construction phase which are inherently a bit more risky. So some things that governments can do are things like provide loan guarantees. So not providing the full funding, but backing some of the loans to reduce the risk that's inherent in any new technology here. In general, I think the government's providing a signal that they see a long-term role for nuclear energy is very important, and also giving a sense that of how the regulatory structure and frameworks to provide long-term agreements to offtake the power from nuclear energy. So one thing we hear from the financing side, is uncertainty about the revenues for these large reactors, for any kind of large investment. And so any of the, let's say, policy frameworks that help support that revenue certainty is another critical element.
Now, bringing some of these ideas together, I think the IEA has said for nuclear energy to be more competitive, it needs to pull its prices down by 40%. So maybe you could just wrap those ideas we've been talking about together and give us a sense of optimism that is actually a possibility, that isn't just a far-off idea that feels quite unachievable at times.
Certainly. So I think the first thing is that there are projects that have been able to achieve the kind of costs that the industry is planning for and is looking at. So these 40% reductions that you mentioned, that would be delivering projects on time and on budget. So it can be done, has been done, and it's about delivering that. The nuclear industry itself is well aware of this challenge and is taking all the steps that it would be required to do that. Part of the reasons we're optimistic again is that we're moving past the first-of-a-kind designs and first-of-a-kind projects for modern designs. So there's reason to believe that the next set of those projects are lower cost. Third, we have new projects and new technologies coming, the SMR projects, which open up a whole new area for cost reductions and a reason for those cost reductions. So when we look overall, we see that nuclear reactors we expect them in the next a decade from now to be built and completed for something like $60 to $80 per megawatt hour, which is lower than the average costs of generation in most markets in the world. So we see it as a cost competitive source of new electricity in most markets, alongside wind and solar, alongside other sources. So in general, we see that with policy plans, with these technology costs, we anticipate that nuclear power would double by 2050 just to deliver on countries' plans. Now, that still would mean it's only 10% of electricity generation in the world. It would also provide some heat, would also produce some hydrogen, so it can produce multiple outputs there. But it's still a foundational role of the energy system, but a very important low emissions source. In our own analysis, where we have less nuclear energy than this doubling, it tends to raise costs. It makes the whole system and transitions more expensive. We're already leaning very heavily on wind and solar, and it means we would have to do that even more. And the additional technologies like storage, and reinforcing electricity grids, those elements start to add up when we go to very high shares. So it's part of this broader, diverse set of technologies, diverse set of low emission technologies to get us to our overall goals.
And if we don't invest, if we don't turn to nuclear energy, could you give us a sense of how difficult net zero targets could become?
If we take out technologies like nuclear power that are dispatchable and low emissions, the challenge of reaching net zero emissions becomes much harder. Wind and solar will be the foundation of transitions because of their low cost and widespread availability. But because of their variability, it's very difficult to fully decarbonize the electricity system and to have stable electricity grids. So we would benefit from having the likes of nuclear power, hydropower, carbon capture and storage as well. These dispatchable technologies help stabilize the grids, ensure that we have secure electricity and energy along the way to the transition to net zero emissions.
Right, Warner, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dan. Enjoyed it. Thank you.